Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. And the topic of this video will be on IQ Part 2. And in the previous video on IQ, I gave an argument for the statistical basis of IQ and its merits as a scientific theory by way of its success in predicting certain factors that correlate to statistical scores on IQ examinations and how they relate to one's natural aptitudes and abilities to either perform computational skills, do procedural knowledge-based tasks, and to come with what Dabrowski calls overexcitabilities as people that test higher on the IQ scale tend to have greater deals of intensity to them and a much greater palette of sensitivity in their nervous system to certain stimuli, which can be categorized and licensed as overexcitabilities or deeply disturbing and engaging passions and centers of concern and motivation. So, now on to IQ Part 2, and in this video, what I would like to say is what it is that a person with high IQ is like. And when you go through the literature, there are collections of traits that are often associated with people who possess high IQs, and what seems to be three central tenets that can be extrapolated or elaborated on in greater detail are the traits of intensity, drive, and sensitivity. So, highly intelligent people have a very large range of sensitivity in their mind and in the way that they experience things. And when I say sensitivity, it is not necessarily emotional sensitivity that they experience, but sensitivity to certain stimuli, and stimuli being information from their environment, whether that be sensual information, emotional information, or intellectual information. Highly intelligent people are much more sensitive to it by way of this sensitivity causes greater observational patterns and discernment in the information that people with high IQs are receiving. So what I mean by this is that it is noticed that people with high IQs, they can do a lot with a little information. So it's to say that you give them a stimulus, and it can be one of sensuality, emotion, or intellectual or even social per se, though the stigma is people who have IQs are essentially socially retarded, and that's not necessarily always true. What is seen and often observed is that they are observant of the stream of information and are quite discerning about it. So it gives them a hue and a disposition to curiosity. Not curiosity necessarily about everything, though many people with high IQs are curious about things in the world and how they take place and why things appear the way that they do. Quite inquisitive in nature, but it is mainly curiosity. To where people who are bright show interest in things, people who are curious, people who have high IQs are curious about things, insofar as that they're receiving information, and the information that they're receiving, they are, in a way, by whatever means, analyzing it or observing it in greater detail and nuance, and they are sifting through this information and trying to discern or make out what it is, and this is by way of their sensitivity to things. They tend to be sensitive, so they tend to have lower levels of arousal. It does not take, they are more curious and they have lower levels of arousal. So it does not take the same amount of stimulus or stimuli or stimulus to get them thinking, digesting, and processing something as it does someone who is bright but not gifted, or as it does someone who is average, or as it does for someone who's below average. It seems that the higher you go up the range in IQ, the greater the sensitivity to stimulus, whatever the stimulus may be. And this has a correlation to overexcitabilities, but it is not merely overexcitabilities insofar as that it is a peculiar vantage point that in perception that they have towards information by way of their high levels of sensitivity to stimulus, whether that be emotional, intellectual, imaginative, social, whatever, what have you. These people are sensual and or sensitive and are easily aroused by stimulus, and it does not take much to get them thinking, questioning, interpreting, discerning, and observing data. And data can come in many shapes and forms, but they are essentially very sensitive to the data and information in their environment, whether it be sounds, photons, words, whatever, what have you. These people are characteristically sensitive. So that, by way, gives them a strong sense of curiosity, or what appears to be a strong sense of curiosity, because they are discerning and looking at minute bits and pieces of data and making out a hue here or an inflection here. There is a deal of nuance to them and what they're receiving, so they're quick to check the patterns or check these structures or check the makeup of whatever it is they're receiving, because they are receiving such a rich density of something at one time. Now, the other trait is intensity, and it is all correlated and related, or it's all related to their nervous system. It has been theorized that the typifying element of individuals with high IQs is that they have a greater density of glial cells, which are cells within the brain that is the sort of packing agency, and things in the globs of tissue in between the neuronal structures that insulate and send message serially by way of astrocytes and whatnot. So it's been hypothesized that people with high IQs have a greater density of glial cells, or white matter in the brain, and that they have a greater cortical integrity in their prefrontal cortex or in other parts of their brain that makes their nervous system and its receptivity much greater than the average individuals. And this has been somewhat substantiated, and in other instances and other ways it has not. The point I bring this up is that there may be a physiological basis for why there is such a sensitivity to individuals with high IQs, and why they are so intense. But from my own personal speculation within research, I think that it is by way of their neurological makeup and their neural phrenology that they are intense individuals because of what they're receiving at the world and how much they're receiving at the world at one time. And when I say intensity, I don't mean a pejorative or a negative connotation to it, but to say that they have a great deal of passion and orientation to things in their environment. And a question that may be asked by a person with high IQ or who is considered to be gifted is, why do you care so much? So it will surprise the average individual how much they care about something and how much a thing can bother them. Things that fall on deaf ears or go unnoticed by many people are things that are very punctuated and highlighted in their vantage point and their scope of seeing the world, and they cannot ignore the robust amounts of information that they're gathering from the environment, and they are greatly affected by them in some way, whether it drives them to study them with an obsession, whether it drives them to completely avoid whatever the stimulus is, whether it drives them to be disgusted or to have great adulation. They are going to have a very, very intense experience in they're going to have a very intense phenomenological existence by way of their experience with the stimulus. And they have a large amount of passion. Maybe they are not emotional, because that's something that comes by way of personality. So people with high IQs, they differ in their personalities, despite what people say. Having a high IQ is not having a certain personality. It's having a cluster of certain traits that are very general and universal from person to person who has a high IQ. But a person with a high IQ can have a number of different personalities and a number of different background experiences that shape their character and who they are, but it's that they are typified and these elements really stand out about them, per se, the sensitivity and intensity. And no matter what they are personality-wise, one will notice that they do have a tremendous amount of intensity to them about a thing. It may be about a few things, it may be about world events, it may be about injustices, it may be about abstraction, but they literally have a passion and a fervor for something that is tumultuous and fiery. It is like they are individuals on fire per se, and they will be on fire about something. Something they're on fire about. Even the most docile of personalities and quiet and introverted and assuming of personalities has some additive like still waters run deep. There is something that is very much alive and hot in them that drives them, and that is the next characteristic is intellecty or autonomy. They are individuals who are driven to do something, and they're driven by themselves. It seems that their sensitivity, their intensity, their sensitivity leads to creativity by way of them being very observant and discerning of things. So it's very easy for them to register anomalies and compare information and see what's not the same about things. They can notice discrepancies and patterns rather easily in something, whether it's music, whether it's taste, whether it's an emotional state, or whether it's some mathematical equation. Some of those things come by way of training, but a lot of it for the individual with high IQ are innate apparatuses and pieces of their cognition that allows them to notice succinct and specific things that are not necessarily privy or things that other people teach one in a classroom. So, and that is a reflection of their curiosity, and it's by way of their sensitivity, and their intensity by way of their experiences causes them to be someone who is non-apathetic towards things, and some things they may not care about, but there is going to be something in their life that can't be non-consequential to them, and they have strong opinions and feelings about things. They are very intense, and I think it's the constellation of these things and their autonomy that essentially are the universal aspects to their characteristics, because many other things can differ. Now, their intellect or their autonomy or industriousness is a rage to master something. Maybe not a rage to master something, because it's hard to say, because the environment does play a role in this, but individuals with high IQs, they can take two approaches about something. They can be very standoffish and reserved towards learning things, but because they are highly self-conscious. Or typically, though, when you go up the scale, like around 140 and 160, and I think that there are some cultural and early childhood experiences that lead to one or the other. They have a very strong drive, and it is hard for most people to understand why they are so driven and how it is that they are so driven. And it's their they have self-generated energy, and they have self-generated direction. What even catches their attention is self-generated, and it is not oftentimes completely or mostly influenced by the outside world, and it is being developed and churned like an engine or a motor inside that individual, and is driving them towards something. They may have, and even when they're wanderous and aimless, the only thing that they may know, even if they don't know necessarily what they want to do, is that they are driven to do something. I think it's why you can have individuals who have high IQs and they do some horrific things like Ted Kaczynski, because they are driven to create and to do things. Even they will create something. They will do something. They are driven to do it. There is no question, and they don't even have a recollection of when it actually originated. It's just there, and that drive, that autonomy, by way of their intensity, I think, is just an autonomy in terms of their industriousness, and leads them towards something. Contrary to popular belief, the personality will inflect how seemingly lazy that they appear, but from personality type to personality type, if you find that a person has a high IQ, there will be something that they drive themselves towards. There will be an intensity that they have and a sensitivity to something. It may be a multitude of things, it may be a collection of things, but those are the general characteristics. And they have most of them have an ability to be rather empathic, and even if they're not empathic insofar as that they're kind, they're not ignorant to what's necessarily that they can read into a situation, and it depends on where they fall on certain spectrums, because giftedness does not come without its costs. And so you can have individuals on two very diverging scales by way of personality disorders, and that is the highly sterile and compulsory side of the scale, which would be autism, and you have a great deal of people who have IAQs who has Asperger syndrome, and the other scale, or some form of autism, or the other side of the scale, which is schizophrenic. And you have so many people who have high IQs, and then you look at their immediate family and their close relatives, and they're schizophrenics, they're depressives, they suffer from bipolar disorder or some sort of mood disorder, and it's the dichotomy between hyper rationalism and working memory and the very expansive and loosely integrated, highly imaginative and creative brain. And most people with high IQ, they're going to fall somewhere on that spectrum, and they're going to be the extreme expressions and dispositions of things. Maybe in some ways they're not. And I think if anybody knows people with high IQs, there are many ways that they're like normal people. But you will find in 2, 3, or maybe one way, but in some very obvious way, they are the extreme, and they are very different from a normal person, and unique and abnormal in their stature in comparison to their peers oftentimes. And that is sort of another typifying element, is that when you take people who have high IQs and you put them amongst their peer groups, the requisite age, or even compare them against people who are much older than them, they are unique because they have a sensitivity to information and stimulus. They are highly intense, and they are very driven, so they accumulate skills, knowledge, and information at a faster rate, and they don't seem to actually mind pain per se. It's something strange to watch per se for most people. It's not always that savants have parents that push them and things, and they have a structure around them that allows them to reach the goals that they do. But it's strange for most people to watch, because the things that they can do to themselves will baffle people, because they are very intense, and they are internally driven, and inward manifestations of their goals and desires really push them, and they are even if they are very empathic and community-based, they are individualistic. It's not to say that they don't like people, because this is a very broad thing, because as I said before, even people with high IQs have different personalities, but it seems that high IQ does something to one's personality that gives them this base structure, insofar as it's something that's superimposed and stacked on top of their already pre-existing personality and disposition. And that's essentially what they are like, in some proportion, in some ratio, and with some variance in the items that exist in those spaces for them, in terms of what they're sensitive to, how intense they are, but they will be more intense than the average person, and how driven they are, and they will be much more driven than the average person, even if they are not as driven as their peers in terms of the IQ scale, because 120 and 120, 130 differs from 120. 140 differs from 130. 160 differs from 140. And once you go past 160, those individuals are typically grossly different from another person. And it's to say that they prefer, because of their peculiarities, and they're very punctuated and asymmetric traits about them, they will not be people that you are going to think is necessarily balanced. And that's one thing that is easy to notice about them, is that just as much as they come with superpowers, they do come with some deficiencies per se in other areas, whether this is scholastic and academic, or whether this is social, whether this is emotional, whether this is whatever would have you, because you can think about it like this: whatever a normal person will be, and we all have our deficiencies and flaws, you will find the same thing in a gifted person, but blown up to a greater and higher resolution. And that's it. And it's not to say that they all come like this, but it's very rare that anybody has it all. And the thing is, though, is that they are acutely different than their peer group. They, because of their asynchronistic developmental patterns, in whatever shape and form that they propagate and manifest into, they tend to prefer the company of their peers, as in people who are intellectually gifted as themselves, or they prefer the company of adults over their peers. Now, it's not to say that they don't like younger people, because it's something that is noticed in gifted people, is that they can be nurturing in some respects to other people and other generations. It's just that they don't necessarily always relate, and depending on their personality, this can be a rub for them, and they tend to prefer the company of people who can understand them, like any person, and adults, because adults have different lived experiences and tend to be interested, surprisingly, in the same things that they are, in terms of when they're 15, they find that a 30-year-old is questioning the same things about reality that they are, so that they, and maybe knows a little more about them, so they like to talk to that 30-year-old adult because they have common ground with them and are pondering essentially the same things that they are pondering. And that's something that's very important to a gifted individual, because they are a very small minority of the population. It is not as if most people are like them, or even have some base experience in the world as they have in the world. And as people, we are social things, and we like to share our experiences and have commonalities. And it is not as if it is so easy for these individuals to have commonality with other people, so they vary in their ranges and in their groups in terms of where they try to find commonality with another person. In the intellectual sphere, it may be with adults. In the emotional sphere, not because their emotionals are retarded, like minds are at times, but because kids can be, kids younger than them, particularly if they're in their preteen years, aren't as vicious and mean as their peers can be, and younger kids tend to be more naive and essentially nicer to older kids, so that's something that they may gravitate towards. And it's not to say that gifted people can't be complete jerks, and because personalities vary, and it's difficult to say what they are specifically like. Now, in terms of their romantic interests, it differs from men to women. Gifted women will not want to be associated with men who possess lower levels of intelligence than they do. And this has been statistically demonstrated. However, gifted men do not care as much because that's something that seems to be more determined by biology.